Hello everyone. In this first podcast created specifically for our patrons, I'll talk about two economic concepts, my use of them in analyzing this rideshare business as part of the gig economy, and why we have theories at all. Let's start there. A theory really is a story. It's a narrative. We invent them every day. We are explanation needing and explanation creating animals. A systematic or scientific theory seeks to explain recurring patterns in a systematic manner. We're also naming animals. In our need to give nomenclature or names to stuff, sometimes as humans we really screw up. The 19th century and a lot of pseudoscience is evidence of that. However, a good theory is absolutely fundamental for moving ahead, and naming is not necessarily always. It's like a basket that we can see how many of a class of actions fit. For my analysis of rideshare drivers in the gig economy, I use a framework. 3 layers of action that are recursive, affect one another, they're emergent, that means they're constantly evolving and changing. A process which has a name, I'm calling it duopsonic duopolies. Now at this point you're saying, what the fuck? What does this mean? Please, I beg you, stay with me for a minute. In today's presentation, I'll be developing a theory and spell out for you my strategy for analyzing this industry, which is one of the first that is entirely gig economy driven. For those of you who are colleagues in my social science life, you'll know some of these terms already, and some of this is obvious. But this is my attempt to explain a lot of these concepts to a larger audience, which I think in general, sometimes as social thinkers, we fail to do. What do I mean when I say this is the first sort of total gig? And what do I mean when I'm talking about it's the first that's entirely gig economy driven? Well, there are industries which I'll provide examples of which have devolved into the gig economy. It didn't start out this way. But this rideshare business isn't the only one, but it's wholly grounded in the gig economy, which could not have developed in a modern form without these wonderful apps that we've all come to let control us. So let's get started. As you know in the pitch for the research that you've supported, I discussed in general my approach to analyzing this rather troubling development in the so-called gig. Now this term is a bit of a misnomer. A gig, for those of you who I have had the honor of playing music with and who are from that community, is a fairly straightforward concept. You play music, you get paid either directly from the person who contracted with you or from a band leader. You pack up your drums and amps and wind instruments and microphones and go home, money in hand. This term, of course, has been appropriated by business journalists and so forth. And again, in classic postmodernist form, runs the risk of losing its original meaning. The concept's been usurped. A nice way to look at this usurpation is to think of the use of the word gig, again, as a sort of hegemonic appropriation. What the fuck, you ask, does this mean? Well, hegemony means, or hegemony means assumptive order. It's a way that control over most of us is exerted through the process of shaping our ideas via culture. For that, you need to look at the way that this whole thing is related in the mass media by editors and telejournalists who all make 6 figures. Appropriation, of course, just means what it sounds like, theft. The idea of a gig has been stolen. The gatekeepers of our economy who found a way around this hard-won employee-employer social contract of the mid-20th century. All you have to do is declare employees as, air quotes here, independent contractors, and you can, when it suits your needs, treat contractees as employees when you deem it necessary, and independent contractors when you Any of you from my academic community know full well that universities have been playing this hat trick for a generation, reducing the number of people who actually teach and do research and inflating administrations. That's why you or your kids pay through the nose to get a university education. It is a failing system. So what the fuck is a duopsonic duopoly anyway? What's this bit of word salad? Well, the good folks over at Amos Web Glossorama, and I provided a link here in the slide, define a duopsony as a system where there are exactly two buyers controlling the buying side of a market. The opposite of this is a duopoly, an extension of the concept of a monopoly. Keep this in mind. While it seems obscure in terms of a market structure, it really isn't. So why is this important, and what are some analogies that can help us to get our mind around it? Think about getting your beef and chicken at the grocery store. Someone grew your beef cows and chickens, farmers. It used to be that farmers could competitively sell their products to a number of competing middlemen who would usually work for processors, butchers, distributors. That classic market equilibrium where there were lots of buyers and lots of sellers in the market, in classic neoliberal terms, sorted this out. Increasingly, due to a handful of companies buying up all the processing entities and then engaging in buying up all the components of the supply chain that were advantageous to them and spinning off those that weren't, the actual production, that would be trucks, freezers, butchering facilities, the farmer was left with only one or two different buyers of their products. These buyers could control the transaction. On the other side of the equation, these monopsonic or duopsonic or oligopsonic buyers were also the sole sellers of these finished agricultural products. So they were effectively what we would term oligopsonies, or just a few buying entities. Excuse my stumbling here. So when we look at this current situation, Uber and Lyft are effectively a duopsony in terms of they're the only buyers, except for a dying taxi cab industry, of people selling their labor. I could conceivably, theoretically, set up my app and go to town, but I think you know how that works. So a duopoly is the flip side of this duopsony. It is when two market entities dominate an entire market in terms of selling the product. For your old heads, think of the phone company back in the day when we were kids, multiplied by 2. Now, because of slack-ass antitrust laws and antitrust law enforcement, mergers are apace, particularly in this pigs at the trough style of capitalism that is so in vogue these days. These folks who own 85% of everything, so we might actually be headed back to 2 phone providers in the very near future. A few other examples of duopolies from the good folks in Investopedia, Airbus and Boeing. Most of us are not buying commercial jetliners for cargo or passenger service, but if we were, there are only 2 players. This is sort of far removed from those in that those are capital rather than consumer goods, unless you're some sort of grand vizier shopping for the best palace in the air, and I think this is probably unlikely. It's easier for us to get our mind around this because we typically sell our services in terms of our labor in fairly spread out ways. We get a job, and then our master term, this term sociologists use to define that placeholder that's most important to us. Our master status is as consumers in terms of economy. We're producers too, but we basically spend most of our time either forcing consuming stuff that we have no control over, mortgages, rent, utilities. So our productive power gets pushed in the background as we figure out how to pay health care, rent, or other bills. The choice is for consumption of products. I just received the 5th advertisement for the bloody Jonas Brothers album, which I have no intention of ever listening to or buying. are both limited and increasingly shaped by taste that we do not necessarily have for products that we don't necessarily. So here you have it. These circles in this slide are approximate visual representations of what this part of the model looks like. The taxi cab industry, which had significant gaps originally, particularly in the exurbs. The exurbs are like the suburbs that get farther out, is dying. As much from regulatory inertia and as from lack of service area coverage as anything else. But this is another story. Often in a place like the northern Kentucky suburbs of Cincinnati, these rideshare services are the only game in terms of moving around. There's no public transport and cabs are not extant in any way, either sparsely or non-existent coverage of areas. It was into this market gap that these rideshare companies burst forth. So how are they faring in general? Here's a screenshot of today's stock performance for Uber. It incidentally had just now crept back to its original IPO or initial public offering price. For those of you like me who don't know anything about playing the stock market, IPO stands for Initial Public Offering. Uber had the worst one in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. The captain of this clown car is Dara Khosrowshahi. And this talk of driverless cars and Uber passenger copters notwithstanding, the initial share value of the stock dropped 8% over the course of the first day. Lyft fared a little better and it's lost $1.15 billion in its first quarter of public offering. This information is from the good folks at the New York Times Financial Desk, and you can click for a look-see. The link that I've provided you. What does this mean for you? If you're a rider, if you take one of these rideshare services, and I expect that you probably do, you're going to pay more. As I have mentioned, through a series of what we'll call life events, I'm now in the business of doing this rideshare action for these two companies as a major source of income. In addition to you paying more for these services, they have made great strides in paying the drivers, including me, less and less money. In future podcasts, we'll look at the corporate culture and the evolution of these debacles, the workers' culture through the lens of the folks who are doing this driving, and the history of this segment of the gig economy. We'll do so by using this framework of duopsonic duopolies. It's a good theoretical storyline from which to put all these pieces together. So there's another way we need to look at another approach in terms of the spear tip of the gig economy, this rideshare business. In addition to the duopoly consumer product model, where value, that's money, is sucked up from both riders and drivers, there are three levels of analysis that we can get a handle on for this phenomenon. So does this mean, this not to seem like a tortured word salad part 2, here's the breakdown. Again, this is giving it something a name and place so we can see how it works. These are all interactive, that is, each level affects the other one. We term the macro, and it means exactly what you think it does, large or big or widespread. We have the entire corporate culture for these organizations. These organizations generate a lot of content. As an organizational sociologist, I might look at some of this content. But the way we can really get at how these organizations are landed in their environment, in a greater business environment, is to get a sense of how they're responding in the totality of the environment in which they're embedded. We're going to get at that through, I'm stumbling here, reading business and general journalism accounts of their machinations, and there is a wealth of this sort of information. I'll be analyzing themes in business journalism that features these two companies from 2012 when Uber rolled out to now, and Uber had its recent disastrous IPO and managerial shakeup with the COO, Khosrowshahi, I'm sorry for mispronouncing his name, vowing to take a more hands-on approach, which gives anyone involved with this at the operant level, the drivers, pause to shudder. And I would think if you were a rider, depending on this, I would be raising an eyebrow too, because you're going to see prices increase. There is a sort of in this middle level of the rideshare culture in the form of social media products created by and for rideshare drivers, which bears some analysis. As the larger organizational level has exerted downward pressure on drivers, the themes in these videos and social media posts has grown precipitously darker. Finally, I'll be conducting an open-ended SurveyMonkey-based survey. SurveyMonkey is a software that I'm purchasing with your help to try and collect drivers' actual accounts. This is going to be a more detailed and will take the longest out of any of these analyses. What they'll do is they'll click a link I will post on Facebook sites where I've gotten permission and which are administered by and for rideshare drivers. This is going to require the most attention, as this is a primary data collection. That means firsthand, measuring collection from the source itself. Rather than existing sources, part of the project. Sorry for the stumble there. So I'll be providing you more content as we move forward here and I develop this in more detail. Thanks for listening and thanks for supporting.